What's next? Jacqueline?
Yeah. So if we were in the basement, this is where we would take a little break and we would all get to pick a few people to talk to and say to them, oh my gosh, I loved what you just wrote. I want to hear more of your poetry, your prose. And that's where we would have a chance to connect. But on Zoom, we have that chance, not quite the same, but we have it on chat. So if you peeked on chat, probably people have mentioned something about what you read tonight. So take a look. So I am going to introduce Michael Goldman, who's our featured reader tonight, and Michael will share his most recent work. And we will also get to hear from him about his process. We'll get to pepper him with questions later on, ask him some things. Michael is a widely published translator, and wow, is that ever true? I just took a look at Michael's webpage before we started, and I think I saw 13 books of translations that have been published, something like that. Translator of Danish literature, a poet, and a jazz clarinetist. Over 130 of Michael's translations and poems have appeared in journals such as the Harvard Review, World Literature Today, and the International Poetry Review. Translated 15 books of Danish poetry and prose, and he runs poetry workshops twice a month at the Northampton Center for the Arts. Tonight he'll be reading from his new work of his first book of poetry called Who Has Time for This? And he lives in Florence. I also want to mention that Michael ran one of the most interesting workshops that Straw Dogs did a few years ago. We do a lot of workshops on Saturday mornings at Forbes Library for a while there. And Michael ran one about translation. And I have to say, honestly, Michael, I thought, how is this going to work? How is he possibly going to run a workshop on translation? It was one of the most interactive, interesting, funny, enlightening workshops that I think Straw Dog had the pleasure of sponsoring. So please welcome Michael Goldman.
Good evening, everyone. Now's the time for fresh-picked garden salads, cucumbers sweet as yet undiscovered by yellow beetles, snow peas straight and crisp, lettuce full and just before bolting, still unfolding from their centers. The vegetables don't care about me, not like I do about them. When the heat hits, they're in a mad spurt to reproduce, already intent on next year. And I'm going around saying, no, 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 right now is the time to be right here at the peak before giving in to biology. I pick now an entire basket of stopped time. I'm going to enjoy it. It tastes so good. So thank you, previous readers. The open mic was wonderful. It was such a treat. Thank you, Jacqueline, Beth, Rick, and everyone at Straw Dog Writers Guild who puts this event on. I'm so happy to be here. It's been 4 years since I read at Writers Night Out. So as Jacqueline mentioned, through some great strokes of luck and quite a bit of disciplined hard work, I had 4 books published this past year. So I'd like to read a little bit from each of them tonight, 3 translations and also poetry. It will include nature poems from a 92-year-old Danish author, essays from a fiery feminist in Denmark, a memoir from a brilliant writer who was also an opioid addict, and then also some of my original work. So, and if you have questions along the way, you can save them for the end, write them in the chat, and we'll see what we get to. So I'm going to start with this book. This is called Dependency. It's by Tove Ditlevsen. And this is the author's own life story. And it gives firsthand insight into severe dependent behavior and drug addiction. And it gives a visceral understanding of what it could be like to be in the author's shoes. Now, more than any other book I've translated, I believe that Dependency has the potential to spur widespread social change around the way we view addiction. It was published by Penguin Classics in September of last year. It's gotten great reviews in the London Times, The Spectator, The Guardian, etc. And it will be published in January by Farrar, Straus and Giroux and distributed in the United States. A couple weeks ago, author and musician Patti Smith recommended it on Twitter. That was pretty cool. So the book chronicles the author's life between the ages of 23 and 35. And this is in the early 1940s and up to the early 1950s. So starts off in World War II when Denmark was occupied by Germany. During this time, she became a best-selling author. She also had 4 marriages, 2 back alley abortions, and an addiction to opioids. She wrote about 30 books, and many people consider this her masterpiece. So I'm going to read a few excerpts so you can get a sense of her dark humor and her life story. So Tove Ditlevsen's first marriage was to a publisher who was 53 years old, more than twice her age. But he was a respected patron of the arts in Copenhagen, and she's about to have her first novel published with his help. And I want to note that she grew up very, very poor, and she was told as a girl that she could not become an author because she was female. So this is an incredible step for her towards her career and a step up the social ladder. She writes, "I do whatever I can to please him because I'm so thankful he married me. Although I know something still isn't quite right, I carefully avoid thinking about that. For some incomprehensible reason, Viggo F. has never taken me in his arms. And that does bother me a little, as if I had a stone in my shoe. It bothers me because I think there must be something wrong with me, that in some way I haven't lived up to his expectations. I feel glad when he smiles at me with his single tooth, pats my hand, says goodbye, and leaves for work. He doesn't want false teeth, because he says in his family men die at 56, and that's only 3 years away, so he doesn't want the expense. You can't hide the fact he's stingy, and that doesn't really meet the high value my mother put on a man's being able to provide. He's never bought me a piece of clothing, and when we go out in the evening to visit some famous person, he takes the trolley, while I have to ride my bicycle alongside, speeding along so I can wave to him when he wants." So not long into this marriage, Tove has a couple of affairs, and she gets pregnant. She writes, "I'm going to have a baby. I can hardly believe it. A tiny clump of mucus inside me is going to expand and grow every day until I get fat and shapeless. Ebbe is not nearly as happy as I am. We have to get married," he says, "and I have to tell my mother. I ask if he has anything against us getting married, and he says, 'No, it's just that we're so young and we have no place to live.' He gets this helpless look in his eyes and at the thought of all the things to consider, and I kiss his fine, delicate mouth. I feel like I have enough strength for all 3 of us. Then I realize I'm not even divorced yet. So I write a nice letter to Viggo F. asking him for a divorce since I'm pregnant. Offended, he writes back, 'I've only one thing to say. Good grief, go to a lawyer and get it done, and the sooner the better.' When I show his letter to Ebbe, he says, 'He's ridiculous. What did you ever see in him?'" So this first birth of their child put a great strain on their marriage. So when Tove gets pregnant a second time, she's determined to have an abortion, even though they're illegal. This is in the early 1940s. Eventually, she turns up a phone number for an abortion doctor, and she sets up a time. She writes, "The doctor greets me in the entry, where a bare light bulb dangles from a hook in the ceiling. He seems nervous and grouchy. 'The money,' he says flatly, holding out his hand. I give it to him, and he nods towards the examination room. He's about 50, small and shriveled, and the corners of his mouth droop as if he has never smiled. 'Come on up,' he says, slapping his hand on the examination table with the hanging straps for patients' legs. I lie down with an anxious glance at the side table, which has on it a row of shiny, pointed instruments. 'Will it hurt?' I ask. 'A bit,' he says. 'Only a second.' He talks like a telegram, as if he's trying to limit the use of his vocal cords. I shut my eyes, and a sharp pain darts through my body, but I don't make a sound. 'Done,' he says. 'If you notice blood or fever, call Dr. Lauritsen. No hospitals. Don't mention my name.' So then, Tove has a one-night stand with a medical student at a party. And soon she's pregnant again. And she doesn't know who the father is, so she's determined to have another abortion. And she gets Carl, the medical student, to perform it in his dorm. He's so infatuated with her, he'll do anything, whatever she wants. He gives her a shot of Demerol first, which is an opioid, and that was normal back then for procedures like that. And she loves it so much that afterwards she asks for one more shot before she leaves. On the trolley back home, she writes what she was thinking. Demerol. The name sounds like bird song. I decide never to let go of this man who can give me such an indescribable, blissful feeling. When I get home, Ebbe wants to know how it was out visiting my friends, but I only give him one-word answers. When he asks me what's wrong, I tell him I have a toothache. I roll over on my side in bed with my back to him, touching the little bump on my elbow from the injection. I'm preoccupied with the single thought of doing that again. I could not care less about Ebbe or anyone else but Carl. So Tove marries Carl, who becomes a doctor and continues to give her shots of Demerol pretty much on demand. And then Tove starts faking an earache to get more shots. So Carl sets up an operation for her fake earache with an ear doctor. She writes, "When I awoke from my anesthesia, my whole head was wrapped in gauze, and then I finally learned what an earache felt like. I moaned in pain, rolling back and forth. 'This hurts so much,' I told the doctor. 'Can't you give me something for the pain?' 'Of course,' he said. 'You can have aspirin. That's the strongest medicine we give in this ward. We don't turn people into addicts.' When Carl finally arrived with his brown briefcase and inside it the blessed syringe, he gave me a shot in the open vein, and I said, 'You have to come by all the time. I've never felt pain like this in my whole life, and here they only give you aspirin.' 'They might as well give you sugar pills,' he mumbled. 'Speak louder,' I said. 'I can't hear you.' 'Well, you're deaf in that ear,' he said. 'You will be the rest of your life, but at least it won't hurt anymore.' So continuing the shots of Demerol, Tove is down to 65 pounds before she's finally driven away by an ambulance to rehab. And her description of going through withdrawal is visceral and raw. And I'm going to read one last excerpt, which is afterwards when she's feeling a bit better. She writes, "Gradually, my miseries lessened. I was able to put my head down on the pillow without the walls creeping in around my bed, and I stopped staring at my watch constantly. I was let out of the belt and allowed to go to the toilet supported by one of the nurses. 'Come here,' she said gently, leading me to a sink. Wash your hands. See if you can do it yourself. When I raise my head, I see myself in the mirror, and I put my hand over my mouth to hold back a scream. That's not me, I cry. I don't look like that. That's not possible. In the mirror, I see a worn-out, aged stranger's face with gray, scaly skin and red eyes. I look like I'm 70, I sob, clinging to the nurse, who leans her head in on my shoulder. There, she says. I didn't think of that, but don't cry. When you start getting insulin, it'll be much better. You'll get more meat on your bones, and you'll look like a young woman again. I promise. It happens all the time. When I'm back in bed, I lie there, looking at my toothpick arms and legs. And for a moment, I'm full of rage at Carl. Then I remember that I carry my share of the blame as well, and my rage disappears. So that's very charged writing by Tove Ditlevsen in my translation. Just want to breathe for a second and kind of let that go by before we move on. So that was Dependency from Penguin Classics, soon by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. Then I'd like to read two poems from this new translation that's just out, called New and Selected Poems of Knud Sørensen. Knud Sørensen is 92 years old, and these are the poems from the previous 10 years of his writing, which won a national award in Denmark last year. He's written about 60 books. Many of these poems touch on the theme of our relationship to nature, being both within us and outside of us at the same time. The first one mentions drought, which we've had here in the area recently, but drought can also happen inside of us as well. After a month and a half of drought. I'm going to read it in English and then in Danish. After a month and a half of drought, accompanied by fanfares of thunder, happiness reigns now over us, and the earth opens its thousands of dry mouths, so the half-dead roots below may regain their belief in life. Efter 1,5 måneds tørke, ledsagede tordenfanfarer, regn og glæde nu ned over os, og jorden åbner sine tusinder af tørre munde, så de halvdøde rødder dernede kan genvinde troen på liv. And here's one more from Knud Sørensen. This is the eyes of the landscape. The eyes of the landscape. A landscape settles at my feet, and confidently it spreads its colors and contains them in vibrating contours. Otherwise, only clouds are in motion, sailing without volition over the land, taking on first one color, then another, each with its warning of the kind of rain about to fall. This is how it is. And I notice the landscape looking at me, feel its gaze swallows me. And suddenly I know the landscape is lending me its eyes to see with. Now I can forget about my own. So that was Knud Sørensen. I'd like to move on to another book that just came out recently. This is Liberated by Suzanne Brøgger. This is a book of essays. It's pretty fat. It's about 30 of her essays from her whole career. She was a journalist, but also a novelist, a poet, and an essayist. She's written about 30 books, and she is a feminist iconoclast, a household name in Denmark. she's probably angered just about everyone in Denmark at some point. Her message of unequivocally looking reality and love in the face, regardless of social conventions and regardless of laws, as a path of liberation, has earned her great admiration, but also opposition. I'd like to read excerpts from three short excerpts from 3 of her essays. In the essay Brothel, she writes, "I go beyond myself and attempt the impossible to find out what is possible. And I'm never disappointed, not in the same way. Because reality does not try and pretend to be something it's not. It doesn't have to live up to anything in particular. It doesn't exert pressure by using dreams or ideals as compulsion to conform. Something which is not ideal, but just is what it is, can't fool anyone. The more I think about reality, the more exuberant I feel. It's not that reality is not keeping pace with ideas. It's the opposite. We die for fictions or believe they are stealing our lives. Reality would not harm a fly. Flies just die, like so many other things." That excerpt was from the essay Brothel, in which she visits a brothel in Paris and offers herself up for sex for an evening to help her break out of old habitual patterns. In this next essay, The Cosmic Temptation, she writes about how it feels to live on the edge of being in the now and to create from that excruciatingly real razor's edge. She writes, "How rare are an ear and an eye when they suddenly get used for something other than to see what has already been seen and to hear what has already been heard. An ear and an eye from the naked 0 point. An eye which has seen nothing and an ear which has heard nothing, but which sees and hears everything for the first time. Just that, to use an eye and an ear from scratch, not to mention having 2 of each, could easily take an entire lifetime." And in her essay, Kissing the Horse, Suzanne Brøgger writes about what courage it takes to resign oneself to and to benefit from life's eternal contradictions and paradoxes. She writes, "We have to bear the internal contradiction, which is the basis for the conversation being able to continue. We have to bear the internal contradiction, which is the basis for the conversation being able to continue, only by accepting the breaks and leaps and dissonances, which are the basis for being able to say something which has not already been said. Only then can life move forward." So that was from Suzanne Brøgger, Essays of Liberation. So finally, I want to read a few of my new poems. And I've been thinking a lot lately about binariness, the opposites of things. Everything from the yin and yang to the language of computers, of X's and O's, to the opposing charges in atoms, the pluses and minuses that actually hold us together, and the decisions that I make daily, the yeses and nos based on my sensory input, which are often in self-serving defensiveness. And I see the oppositional forces in our society too, in our community. And nature doesn't seem to care a lot about that, as nature goes about its business, surviving amidst our chaos. So that being said, I'd like to offer you a few poems. A study in approaching infinity. Nature is busy while I am careful. Nature is drunk with herself. I keep trying to find solutions. Nature is gaining on me. I'm just another collector of stories. History is a lot of answers to the same question. How did we get here? Followed more often than not by, what went wrong? I feel partly it's my fault. I could have done something, and we wouldn't be right where we are. But it's too late. And by looking back, the present becomes an orphan, and I can't take it in. In case you're wondering, the answer is yes. You signed up for this. Which I don't mean in a blaming way, but in a way that validates all you are. This is your moment. A moment. So I crouch down, and this chickeny creature comes padding over and nestles between my legs and against my chest. Maybe it's a young crane or a gosling. I'm not good with birds. And I start talking to it in Pidgin Ancient Greek, which I've taken up again, since I can't stand it when people talk baby talk to animals. I don't know how much it understands, but it's giving me the eye. I'm sure some of my conjugations are wrong. Brainchild. So I created this thing. It's the kind of thing people have thought about for ages.
Michael, you're muted.
Oh my God, how did I get muted? Okay. Did people hear the whole last poem?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Just when you start with it, okay.
All right. Brainchild. So I created this thing. It's the kind of thing people have thought about for ages. So I feel a bit embarrassed calling it mine. Actually, it's yours. Avocados. I was walking with my groceries, an ordinary person doing the most extraordinary thing. A bag with items from Mexico, Canada, California, Spain, and Florida. Because how else could I eat in this white winter? With anonymous saviors, I am bartering my life. My legs are swinging as if it were nothing peculiar, just moving along the sidewalk. I can't distinguish between my rights, my freedom, and my privilege. I'm such a small sovereign, looking forward to my solitary meal. Everyone's invited. You are too. But it's a secret. Last poem for tonight. The darkness. Plenty of darkness happens in the light of day. But night is when the stars shine through. So thank you for listening. This is my poetry book. It's called Who Has Time for This? And all of my books, I have all of them, and I'd be happy to arrange to get you a signed copy if you're interested. You can just write to me at hammerandhorn@gmail.com. hammerandhorn@gmail.com. And also, Jacqueline mentioned I host poetry workshops twice a month. I've got one coming up on Sunday, and you can register for them. It's too late for this Sunday, but you can register for other ones through the Straw Dog website.
Great. Thank you so much, people. And I have a question for you, and I know probably other people do too. So I'm going to ask my question, and then if other people have questions, raise your hands, and Michael can call on you, and you can unmute yourself. But so you have had to translate these books. You have had to immerse yourself in this Danish culture in order to make sensible translations back into English. And I can't help but think that immersing yourself in a totally other culture with their sensibilities and their history, their sense of humor, I wonder how that has affected your own writing and your own thinking.
Living in Denmark, speaking Denmark, I feel almost like an honorary citizen or something, and serving Denmark and serving Danish literature has certainly made me feel like my world is much bigger than the suburbs of New Jersey where I came from. And I feel much more like a citizen of the world. So I'm really thankful for that, of being able to look, also to be able to look at the American culture from the outside, as well as experience it from the inside. As far as the literary part of it goes, it is absolutely, I mean, if it were not for Benny Andersson, the first poet who I translated, if it weren't for him embracing my translations of his poetry, I wouldn't be reading to you tonight. Because it was the translating of Danish literature that kind of gave me permission to revisit my childhood dreams and abilities of being a writer and being able to write what my feelings and thoughts and experiences were, and brought it from being just a hobby and a little side thing that I did once in a great while to becoming more and more front and center in my life. And as I've translated many different authors, it's brought out different voices within me, almost like giving me permission to write in different voices. As you probably heard, there was a few different kinds of poetry that I just presented, and because, and I think that I can thank the act of translating and the act of being intimate with many Danish authors to help cultivate what I can say as an artist. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Great, thank you. So if other people have questions about anything, and Michael will call on you.
Yeah, Beth, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated with translation and how form, especially form that is very particular to, like iambic pentameter or assonance, dissonance, how it works in translation. How you can fit one language into another in such a perfect way. And I'm not going to ask you to explain that, because I know that's big. But something that stood out was that the memoir you were reading from, the woman likened Demerol to the sound of birds. Is that what she said?
She did, yeah. She said it was like it sounded like bird song.
I was really curious, what is she hearing that makes Demerol sound like the sound of birds? Is there a translation of sound here that we're sort of not privy to?
The original medicine, the medicine in Danish is called pethidine, or pethidine, which is not anymore like bird song than Demerol. I think this is what was happening in her in her mind, was that anything that could make her feel like that, the name of anything would sound like bird song. So yeah.
I got to tell you though, the word you just used does sound much more.
You think so?
It's less clunky than Demerol.
Yeah.
So it's just really, really. And I have to say, Michael, I was just so swept away. Your delivery, your work is just, it's just riveting. And I got to thank you. Just wonderful.
Thank you. Lindsay, I see your hands up.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
That was so beautiful and powerful. When you read I'm not sure if it was a poem or part of an essay in the native language.
Yeah, that was a poem.
That was a poem. It was so somatic.
Mm.
And I wonder how I'm curious how you take, language has this somatic quality. And I wonder how, as a translator, you work with that, the sounds of the language and the experience in your body, and I suppose in your brain of the language, and how that works into our language. How do you make that transition and that bridge?
Yeah. Yeah, also a great question. I mean, translators call that, or tend to speak of that as the music of the language. That every language has its own music, and
Yeah.
and then on top of that, every writer has their own voice. So that's a balance that I want to strike. To identify the author's voice, so I'm using the right tenor of vocabulary, but also as closely as I can the rhythms that they use as well, and it speaks a little, it does, I guess, think it speaks a little bit to what Beth was getting at as well, just kind of the mimicking the flow of the original as much as possible by immersing myself in their voice in the Danish and knowing the Danish so well. I read Danish literature for 25 years before I started translating. Just taking in, devouring as many different great authors as I could. And so when I finally turned to that, I feel like I could really distinguish the different voices. And then I'm also a musician. I play music every day. I've been playing with a band for years and years. And so I read everything out loud that I translate. And so if it doesn't sound right, if the klang, what is that? If just the tone of the voice, or even just a word, or just the end of a line doesn't sound quite right, I'm going to keep working it until it flows and feels like the original. And it's a very personal thing. Another translator might do it differently, but I want to be as sensitive as I can to the music and the intent of the original.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great question. Are there any other questions out there? I don't see any hands, so. Oh, wait, there was one. Ginny, yeah. Go ahead, Ginny.
Unmute. So, Michael, that was really powerful, and I was so glad you also read things in Danish as well as English. And I'm wondering about, we're talking about voice, so we're talking about your voice, and we're talking about the music of each language. And so what I'm wondering is, are there ways in which you function or perform in Danish that are different from when you're performing in English or when you're thinking in English? In other words, and sort of, are there places you can't go? In other words, are these worlds really completely accessible to each other, or are there ways in which we really can't go all the way? Do you understand what
I'm sorry, I don't know what you're asking.
I'm asking if you, having spent so much time translating from Danish, are aware of any impediments or limitations on your ability to do that. Are there any ways in which it's not completely miscible, the two things together?
Are you asking about like what things can't be translated?
No, I'm really more asking about your experience. Like, how are you completely, do you feel completely whole in that other language and able to reach everything you need to reach, or do you feel limits?
So not being, I mean, I have limits in English to be honest with you, and the same is true in Danish, and I mean, any literature, like I'm reading books in English and I'm looking stuff up, so I have to do that in Danish too, especially like I've been working on a book that was written in 1915. It's like, oh my God, like there's words and expressions that I've never heard. So there's always limits. I think we probably all run up against this in the writing. Not being a native speaker of Danish is one of the reasons I don't translate into Danish, because I definitely have limitations in the idiom. So I only translate into English because that's my stronger language, and I can be more flexible and have more choices. It's a combination of doing research, of looking stuff up, of having access to some good dictionaries, of having access to family in Denmark that I can ask stuff of sometimes. Like if there's an expression that I just can't find anywhere, or even asking some of the authors that I work with, what is this? What are they talking about? So I hope that answers your question.
Well, yeah, it's such a fascinating big thing that you've taken on. It's really impressive.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. Who was that?
I don't know if you can see
Giovanna?
Giovanna, but she has.
Oh, okay.
Giovanna,
Yeah.
yes.
Hi, Michael, you were so submersed in some really powerful, very personal feminist stuff in some of that material. Did you find your own voice afterwards becoming more androgynous? How did that affect you in your own work?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. So after translating Dependency, the memoir, an author in Denmark who translated like a Me Too novel, a woman, she's 40, and it won the National Book Award last year. And it has to do with domestic violence, it has to do with abandonment, it has to do with a young woman raising a daughter single-handedly, and she asked me to translate this novel. And I was a little bit surprised, but it was because she read my translations. And but I was kind of surprised that she didn't ask a woman to do it. So all I guess what I would say is, in the act of translating, I feel a little bit like an actor. That I'm trying to embody the voice of the author as close as I can, to 100% in English, and recreate it in English at that register, at that tonal quality. And so that's one. So that's kind of the professional part of it. But I've been married for 30 years, and I so I am I'm continually faced with my feminine partner, my alter ego, who sometimes it feels wants me to be more like her, and it's like what it's what Suzanne Brøgger wrote. I continually go beyond myself. I go beyond myself and attempt the impossible to discover what is possible, and I'm never disappointed. Something like that. Yeah, go ahead, Ed.
When you just referenced sort of channeling the other person's voice, the first book that I wrote and the one that I'm working on now, that's what I feel like I'm attempting to do sometime. In the first case, it was a man that I was writing about. In this case, it's a woman, and I'm trying to convey a woman's emotions and her voice. And I'm wondering, when you're translating, in some cases you're translating authors that you have actually spoken to, in some cases not. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, most of the authors I've translated are deceased.
So does it make any difference when you've actually been able to speak and listen to the person, the live person, when you're translating?
It is a what's the word? It's a benefit. It's like it's a great benefit of the job to become friends with some of these authors, to be able to have lunch with them, to be able to write emails back and forth, to have tea with them, to visit with them. I mean, it's a great side benefit.
I understand that. My question, I think, is does it influence your translating in any way?
Not that much,
Okay.
except when I need help. If they're alive, then I can write to them and say, "Did I get this right? Am I get you know is this right? You know?" But as you know, I mean, what we leave behind are the words on the page, and the body of work that we have accumulated. And hopefully, a perceptive reader or translator can kind of embrace the whole and find that tone and find that music, long after we're gone. That's so. I love the personal connection, but I don't find it necessary.
I think you've succeeded.
Thanks. Anybody else out there? I've got 4 different screens here, so I'm trying to see any. I don't see any more hands raised. So.
I have one more question.
Go ahead, Jacqueline.
Please notice the envy in my voice. So you've had 4 books published in 1 year. For those of us who have not, could you share with us what that feels like?
So it was feeling a little overwhelming, actually, in the spring, but it's really I don't know. I guess I'm a little bit embarrassed. It feels a little bit like an embarrassment of riches that I've had 15 books published in the past 7 years. I mean, it's like after coming out of a career as a full-time carpenter, it doesn't make any sense. But what has happened is that I followed the kind of like rebirth. I kind of like reinvented myself. That I found the starving artist in me that had been waiting for a really long time. And I finally started feeding him, and he just took over. And so it's been kind of like a roller coaster, just one thing after another after another. I mean, I haven't taken many breaks. It seems like whenever one project ends, the next one starts, and I've got a backlog. So it feels really validating, right? That I chose something and it like worked out. So I get that. And there's also a sense of service. Like I not only am I validating myself, right? That I've done, I've cultivated this practice and this art, this craft. But then I've also turned it around. I'm serving a culture that has really fed me in all the years that I've read Danish literature. And now I'm also, through developing my own poetry, I'm now serving other writers by hosting workshops where they can communicate and support one another. And so I just feel great about the whole thing.
That is really a great, beautiful, fantastic story. That you are following what you love, and we all get to benefit from it. Thank you very, very much, Michael. That was terrific.
Thank you too. Thank you for coming, everyone. It was my pleasure. It's my pleasure.
And so we will be back